I'm Simon Hoof, and I've lived in this house all my life. It was bought by my grandfather nearly 100 years ago with the idea of making it into a sort of art centre and a place where people could be inspired by coming to the house and looking at things and discussing the arts and discussing literature and so on. And that has really continued with my parents and then indeed with myself. Over the years, I have developed a great interest in the art of the book and the history of illustration, and that is what I've chiefly written about. Certainly inspired by books in this house, and certainly inspired by the atmosphere of this house. And I've also written a bit on architecture and country houses, and also on this area, because we are in the centre of this rather small county, Bedfordshire, which has its own characteristics and own personality, I would say. Avenue House is a place of history and a place of stories. The rooms here speak for themselves in many ways, but I also think they need an interpreter. So I really feel that I have to be the interpreter for this house, that I have to be the mouthpiece for all the things which are dumb elements. They are bursting to tell their story, but they need somebody to come and touch them into life with some magic. And so this is what I intend to do on my visit with you to the house, to have my mind on various things that I see, and they will be a touchstone for my stories or my ideas or my memories. And that is the way the house will be kissed into life like a sort of Sleeping Beauty. We've started the interviews in this room because it was my grandfather's room, and it's one that I associate very much with him and his life here. And of course it's remained completely unchanged. But more particularly because this is where he began his filming in 1956, when the BBC came down and the producer of that day, Humphrey Fisher, organised this outside broadcast, which was very unusual for those days, and did interviews with him in this house nearly 60 years ago.
You're talking about my house.
I have indeed.
That's very nice. Just make yourselves comfortable.
Thank you. I was commenting, in fact, about the absence of electricity here.
Electricity? Electricity.
The first time the film crew came, I was away at school. But when they came on the second time to actually do the outside broadcast live in this house, I was actually around. It was very early in the new year, and I had not gone back to school, and so I do actually remember it. And a BBC van came down, and there were about 10 people in the crew who came to do the interviews. And the most remarkable thing was that, of course, my grandfather had no electricity in Avenue House whatsoever. And so all the electricity had to be brought from the nearby cinema, which was about 100 yards, 200 yards away, a small cinema. And so they had to bring in great cables over the wall from that area and through the garden and up to the house. So it was a most incredible piece of organisation. And how the BBC undertook it, I don't know, but somebody in the BBC must desperately have wanted to do this film show of Sir Albert in his own home. This is the study, or little library of Avenue House, which I always feel is really the centre of the whole place. It's where the research went on. It's where my grandfather came to look at the books, to sit, to write. And it was also the place where you knew that you could find him, but you had to knock on the door and approach rather gently because you did not wish to disturb his train of thought. He would be in here with his paper and his pens. You hear the scratching of the pen on the paper, and he'd be going to the bookshelves here, taking out an architectural volume, studying it, making some copies, replacing it, going back, thinking. So it was a place of quiet and tranquility and study. And it was really the centre of the whole organisation of the house. It was the fulcrum of Avenue House, where everything started and ended. The bookcase here contains architectural books running really from the early 16th century right through to the early 19th century. They were an amazing resource for him. He was one of the last of the tradition of architects having great libraries. In the tradition of Sir William Chambers and Sir John Soane, libraries that were consulted. I mean, Lutyens, his friend, only had 3 architectural books, but he had thousands, and he consulted them all the time. And these books are, of course, a complete history of how the country house in this country evolved, and they actually demonstrate, volume by volume, how the country gentleman and the architect worked together to create the famous tradition of the English country house. Here is a book from the bookshelf, Normand's Decoration, which is 1817, a French book. And you can very easily see from the designs how my grandfather was actually working on designs from this book. So we see here Normand's originally his designs for the vases, and my grandfather has been working out schemes based on Normand's vases, and a piece of paper, a tracing paper, is still existing in the book where he has been working out his ideas, adapting the empire style for his own designs in the 1930s or 40s. An interesting piece of working practice. In the corner of the room here is the bust of my grandfather, which was made in 1954, and it's very appropriate really because it was the work of the sculptor Kathleen Parbury, who had been my grandfather's pupil at the Slade in the 1920s, and also was a local person. She lived in Bedfordshire, about 15 miles away from here. And so it was very appropriate that she should approach him and ask if he could sit to her while he was president of the Royal Academy in 1954. And this indeed took place. And his diaries actually show that he had 12 sittings for this portrait bust. And on every occasion, the PRA criticised quite strongly the work in progress. It must have been absolutely, absolutely dreadful for the sculptor who had been his pupil, but who was being told what to do. Put a little bit more there and a little bit there, and try and fill out the face or do something to the hands. Actually, my father, who of course knew my grandfather extremely well over years and years, said that it was a very good likeness, although the shoulders were a bit narrow, but the hands were absolutely beautiful because everybody remarked on his hands. And particularly Jim Lee's Mills said, "What beautiful hands" to me, and I think Betchman said, "What lovely hands." So the hands were the things that really were most striking about my grandfather when people met him. This is the drawing room of Avenue House, which was built in 1818 for the Morris family and added on to the original house. We think the architect was John Wing of Bedford, and this sort of tradition of Wing, who was a pupil of Henry Holland, comes over in some of the details of the fireplace and the cornices and the scale of the room too, which in this case is rather bigger than the rest of the house, rather grander in scale. Now, we think that the Morris family decided to do an extra bit of the room here, make a wing of the eastern side of the house, in order to entertain. So this room was created really probably for music and for family gatherings. It was originally furnished in rosewood with brass inlay, which is called buhl, although it wasn't really buhl in the French sense, but it was inlaid brass furniture. And the complete suite was done in the Grecian taste for this room in 1818. And when my grandparents came here, almost 100 years later, the furniture, of course, had been dispersed, the original furniture, but they decided to furnish it in a slightly earlier period of time, which accorded more with their tastes. In other words, the satinwood period of the 1780s to 90s. And for this purpose, they acquired this rather remarkable set of drawing room chairs, a sofa and window seats. And they date from the end of the 1780s and are satinwood, kingwood, with shell motifs on the side of the joint of the furniture here, beautiful bowed fronts, beautiful semicircular shield backs, and the lines are actually extremely smooth, and there's no jarring feature about them at all. Now, they would be a very important and historic set in any case, but these chairs, and indeed the one I'm sitting on, were made by order of George, Prince of Wales, as a special present for his lady love and secret wife, Mrs. Fitzherbert. And these chairs, the whole set, were on her house on the Steyne at Brighton. They were in her rooms there, and they remained in her family or her nephew's family for some time. We have got about half the set here. We've got all the seat furniture, but there's also some bookcases and tables and Pembroke tables, which are in the Brighton Pavilion. So we've got about half of the original set here. And they were bought finally by Lord Northbrook in the 19th century. And in about 1900, he had them all covered in this rather Edwardian pattern. The only surviving part of the original silk covering is on the window seats over there, where there is a rather nice sprig pattern, very dilapidated, but the Victoria and Albert Museum said I shouldn't have it covered, so we've never have it covered. But that is the original sprig pattern, which is rather bolder than what you see here. So the furniture in this room was gathered together by my grandparents in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And the earlier views of the room taken for Country Life in 1934, shortly before Queen Mary came here, show a rather emptier room, actually. I mean, the pains of the collector, or should I say the problems, the burdens of the collector, is the longer he goes on collecting, the more stuff he accumulates. More and more stuff comes in. So that the earlier photographs show a fairly empty room, and now we have a very crowded room. An old lady friend of mine said that she rather preferred it when it was less crowded. When she came here in the 1920s, there was a grey carpet. The curtains were purple then, and there were just a few gilt chairs, and the effect was absolutely astonishing and stupendous. But as time went on, more and more was accumulated. And that is what happens in a growing collection. It's an organism. It never stays in the same place. While talking about the collection, I ought to mention this very beautiful vase, which is behind me here. And this is a French vase of about 1810, and it was almost certainly designed by Thomire of Paris, who was the chief ormolu artist and medalist to Napoleon I. And this and two other vases in this room were acquired by my grandfather after the First World War. And to show you how things continually evolve and accumulate the facts, really, of the collection, only a few years ago, while cleaning one of these vases, I discovered a label on it saying that it came from the Chateau de Sully on Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and came from a famous collection there in the 1900s. And this, of course, I never knew. It's absolutely typical of the neoclassical style, the Empire style, with the ormolu figures based on Greek vases running round the side of the vase, and these very elaborate and grand handles. And it makes a particularly striking centerpiece to this window of the view looking out and up the garden. I ought to draw your attention, I think, to the paintings on the wall here. There are three very interesting fancy pictures painted in the 1740s by Mercier, Philippe Mercier, who was a continental painter but who came over and worked in York. And these are rather favorite pictures of mine, and they represent different times of day and different features connected with ordinary life. And they began to come in as a sort of popular image in the 1740s, 1750s, and they actually gave rise to Francis Wheatley's Cries of London eventually. But these are posed subjects. And in each case, it's the artist's wife, Mrs. Mercier. And here she is in this particular picture, where she is in a rather beautiful cap and neckerchief and beautiful silk gown, posing, in fact, as an oyster seller. And this, again, was painted at that time, 1740s, and obviously no oyster seller is ever going to look quite as clean and decent as this woman. She's very much brushed up. And this is the way he wished to show his wife at the time. And this must have been quite a popular image because it was actually engraved for a thing called Houston's British Meltons in the 1760s. There's a slightly rococo feeling about this, the way the drapery is arranged, and even the play of the hands and the light on the oysters, which give a certain sort of theatrical feeling to it. And then on this picture here, again, it's the artist's wife with her little dog taking breakfast. And you see the dog begging for something. She's eating rusks, which I think were probably more common in those days for breakfast in England. And she's using a Chinese blue and white service, tea service, which is the height of fashion. And this is signed in the right-hand corner. And then on the other side of the window over there is the same lady posed by candle with her prayer book, with her cap on, ready to go to bed. And that is called bonsoir, and this one is called bonjour. So there are the two times of day. In the corner here, we have a very beautiful picture of the Contessa Memo of Venice, and she was painted by Angelica Kaufmann in 1785. And the bill for this picture still exists in Rome, where the portrait was painted. It's an exceptionally beautiful and sensitive picture of this Italian aristocrat who was really only about 15 at the time. She became the mistress, I think, of Eugène de Beauharnais, Napoleon's stepson, and she lived to a very great age into the 1840s. I was very lucky that her great-great-grandson actually came here a few years ago to see this picture. This is a rather fine display cabinet made for Earl Cadogan in the 1770s, satin wood with the most beautiful engraving on it, and this is attributed to John Cobb, the cabinet maker. Inside, one finds some of Sir Albert Richardson's miscellaneous collections. In fact, I would say a cabinet of curiosities. I just mention one or two of these rather fascinating items. To begin with, a rather beautiful 18th century fan, French of the 1760s, with a magnificent Roman triumph, beautifully hand-painted on it. And also on the other side, the most fantastic collection of wild flowers and roses and tulips painted in the 1760s with a very accomplished hand. And of course, what is even more charming is that it's actually kept in its original 18th century case, as it would have been bought in one of the display places in Covent Garden in the 1760s. Equally decorative is this napkin for George IV's guests at Carlton House, with the Prince of Wales's feathers on it, printed, and a remarkable survival. Here, perhaps a little more gruesome, is the death mask hand of Benjamin West, which was taken in 1820 when he died, and has particular significance here because we have a very famous painting of West in the dining room. Reminiscences of the happy gatherings at the other club, one of Sir Winston Churchill's cigars given to the professor, and it's got the specially made for Churchill on the cigar band. Another curious little item, in the days of the great architecture in the 1900s, 1920s, architects designed their own keys for special buildings, and here are two marvellously designed neoclassical keys, specially made for some of Sir Albert's buildings in London. And he had a key, a very similar key, designed from his own ideas for this house, which was made in the 1920s. This is what we call the Green Bedroom, which is the largest of the principal bedrooms in Avenue House. And it's the room occupied by my grandfather and grandmother for the whole of the time that they were here, that is to say 46 years. And in many ways, it is the most attractive of the rooms in the house because it looks both onto the street side and onto the garden side here. And the alcove here, which leads into this embrasure going towards the garden window, was originally a powder closet, and it was opened up to create this extra little feature of the room in about 1900. In this room, the professor seems to have gathered together a number of things which he brought back from his tours abroad. So it has a continental flavour in some of the art treasures here. Particularly on the table, I would mention this small bronze bust of Napoleon by the artist, the French sculptor Courbet, which was actually sculpted in about 1800, and it shows Napoleon as a very much young, heroic figure when he was a general of the Republic. And this rather diminutive bust has a great charm about it. And it does also show how very keen my grandfather was on the Napoleonic era, not simply from the political point of view, but of course from the artistic point of view, the Empire style, which led on to the Regency style, which he was really one of the main people to instigate the revival of the Regency style in England. And then on the walls, I'd also mention these rather wonderful paintings, again brought back on tours, not necessarily abroad, but particularly to Scotland and Ireland. And he collected continental pictures from the end of the 15th century right through to the 19th century. In this room, particularly interesting, I think, is a church interior by Van der Vliet, the Dutch school, about 1640s to 50s, and very much a Protestant picture showing the grave of William the Silent in the great church at Delft. And then to the right of that, a Spanish school painting by Juan de Valdez Leal, and above the cabinet, really is fantastic view of the mid-16th century, which could be the School of Prague, but we don't quite know who it is, but great intensity and vividness really in the colours and the greens and the mountain peaks and the little crouching figures. These are some of the things that are particularly interesting. And from further afield than Europe, one ought to mention this extraordinary architect's model in ivory, which for many, many years defied all explanation. Nobody knew what this building could possibly be for. It was clearly an architect's plan. It was obviously carefully thought out. It must surely have been built or produced in plan form. And nobody knew, but only a few years ago, Professor Wilton Ely, on a visit to Calcutta, discovered that this was, in fact, the Hazaraduri Palace outside Calcutta, which was built in 1830 by the Scottish architect Ferguson for the Maharaja of Musharadabad. And it still stands there today, and I've seen photographs of it. And it is now, alas, simply a government office. But it is a remarkable monument to the power and grandeur of neoclassical architecture in India, in the British Empire at that time. My grandfather was interested in every aspect of 18th century life, and he liked to collect small objects which brought that period to life and which he was able to use in many of his books, studies and lectures. In this little Sheraton cabinet, he had the collection of small objects which were in everyday use in the 18th century. If we begin with the lower drawer here, there are scent bottles, there are keys, there are small vinaigrettes for use in the lady's purse, there are tie pins, or cravat pins I should say, the stopper for a pipe, a little box for the lady's dressing table, and even an artist's model of the 18th century. These were small objects of everyday use. In the upper part of the cabinet here, a lovely collection of 18th century gentlemen's pocket watches, which really came to their absolute supreme part of their craftsmanship in the 18th century. So here we have some, like this enamelled watch, which is from Geneva in about 1780, and we have French watches, a French watch by Breguet, and this one, which has a shagreen case of the 1760s, is quite charming because you open it up and it has a transcription of the Lord's Prayer in miniature on the back of the where the watch paper might be. And this one is of particular interest, Meuron of Paris, probably 1790, and this is a repeater so that you can tell the time from the striking, even when you're in the dark or travelling. Well, this is the gazebo of 1746, which was created by the originator of these gardens, Sir Simon Erlin, who laid out these gardens in the 1740s. And Avenue House was built on a corner of the grounds. The Exceeding family acquired them in 1800. So our garden here is much earlier than the house. This, I believe, is where the judge, Sir Simon Erlin, used to come in his vacations from the London Assizes, where he was recorder, and he used to sit here and meditate on all the people he'd sent to the gallows. The views here are down the avenue towards the house that he built in 1727, and therefore, rather oddly, our garden and this gazebo, this temple, faces towards the other house. The temple here was used by my grandfather for writing in. He used to come up here in the summertime and sit here, have tea, and write his lectures on architecture. And this was always something that he did in the summer months. And in a way, I've perpetuated it by coming up and writing articles and occasionally things for my books in this place, which is still and pleasant and with beautiful views and beautiful lighting. My earliest memories are coming up here with my grandmother and my nurse when I was about 3 or 4. And my grandfather took my grandmother and I outside, and he then proceeded to do a watercolour of us. And I'm shown as a small boy of about 4 or 5, and my grandmother sitting there, and that watercolour, which took him about 2 hours to complete, was then exhibited in various galleries, and I still have it in one of my rooms. I enjoy the atmosphere. It has all these nice grained oak panelling here, which is purely illusionistic. It's trompe l'oeil, really, and very beautifully done in the 1740s, so it looks as if it's sort of oak panelling, but in fact it's just paint. And it's quite nice to be in a wooden building of this sort, with the Palladian features outside. And on one of the windows here, on that side of the building, somebody in 1769 cut their name with a diamond on the window pane. I think it's J.S. We don't quite know who it was, because at that particular period of time it was owned by a family called Pauncefort, who had succeeded Sir Simon Erlin here. And so I enjoy the reveries of the past, the past that is in my own memory, but also the distant past of Avenue House and its grounds 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago, 250 years ago. One can imagine the people coming out from the house at the end of the avenue in their beautiful brocaded dresses, and Sir Simon Erlin and his long waistcoat of the day, and coming up here and drinking wine in tall stem glasses up here, and no doubt discussing the newspapers which they would have got from Northampton. The only newspaper was from Northampton, and so it would have been a place to relax in. Sometimes I have actually been up here with friends in the evening and just watched the dark go down and the light on the trees disappear, and occasionally a fox will slink across the avenue and into the bushes on the other side. It's a wonderful way to end an evening. As we're coming towards the end of the tour of Avenue House, I thought we ought to end up in Hagbush Cottage, Hagbush Hall as it was called, which is right down the end of the garden and has a little separate orchard garden of its own. This was originally the gardener's cottage in the 18th century, and in fact the original fireplace of the gardener's cottage still exists here. And it's been a retreat for my family for 60 years. And it's very much my secluded place of work and study. And I'm down here, even in the wintertime, almost every day of my life, at least looking in a little bit. And I have my books here, and I'm able to write here and enjoy the seclusion of a place which could be, although we're only a few hundred yards away from the centre of a small town, this could be lost in the country because it's so far away. And I've got one or two of the items that my grandfather used to have down here. And these include the pewter plates and old forms of lighting, some of the oak furniture, and a painted wall hanging. And I actually have a bed down here, and I have, in the past, spent quite a lot of nights down here. Lovely to wake up in the morning and hear nothing but the birds and the sound of the rustling in the trees. And of course, I've usually had my dog with me. The current dog has never, I think, been down here when I've been sleeping, but the other dogs used to come down here when I was sleeping. So that, yes, it's a good way to end our visit. And oddly enough, when the BBC came in 1956, they photographed a lot of things around here. They didn't actually photograph the interior of this cottage. Perhaps they couldn't do so, but so this is the first time the camera has actually been inside this rather private place.